I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. Glad to be here and glad to have you along today as well. Today is Thursday, August 3rd, 2023. And as always, I'm expecting to deliver what I call a robust conversation, good conversation. We're kicking it up, talking about issues that matter to us, our point of view. In my mind, we're assembling the world in ways that make sense to us and that reflect our intention and our duty, our responsibility to be stewards, to be the authors of futures in which we win. Well, before I get going to housekeeping things, one, always I want to invite you to support this program by becoming a subscriber. You do that by going to YouTube, Insight News MN, and click on the subscribe button. It costs you nothing except to click. But also while you're there, click on like and click on share. We want to get 1,000 subscribers. We're on the way, maybe halfway there, but we'll be one click further if you take a second today to go to YouTube, Insight News MN, and click. Sharing with you that we are streaming on a variety of platforms, and we'd love to know where you are, where you're checking in. So if you're on one of the YouTube channels, the Insight News YouTube channel or the Black Press USA YouTube channel, if you're checking with us through Facebook, Black Press USA, Facebook Insight News, Facebook Al McFarlane. If you're connecting through LinkedIn or Twitter, however you're connecting, shout us out. Drop a note in the comment section. Say hello, say where you are, and comment on today's conversation or suggest things we should be chopping up on this program in the future. And finally, we want to also, in the way of housekeeping, remind you to be COVID conscious, COVID aware. We join our friends over at the Minnesota Department of Health, inviting you to be aware that risk still exists. So we have to continue to follow the COVID-19 protocols. That means washing your hands, staying aware, prioritizing prevention. The idea is that together we can create awareness and encourage testing and help everyone stay healthy. So my friends, enjoy the show. And remember, stay well, get well, and stay healthy. So with that, we want to begin by welcoming my colleague and friend, Dr. Irma McLaurin, to the show. Dr. Irma, how are you doing? How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm back in North Carolina, so I
Okay.
was in Mobile, I think, the last time.
Okay. Well, take a minute before we go into the several topics that have to do with education. We're going to be talking about both, the impact of higher education on small towns and on the GOP in particular. We're going to talk about elite schools and what they mean for our community, and talk about what Black schools are doing, HBCUs are doing to respond to the new rules and legislation about admissions. Those things we'll cover. But before we do that, Dr. Irma, you're going to be doing some traveling shortly and doing some reporting from Brazil. Take a minute and tell us what's going on.
Well, one of our contributors, Esmera Hudamani Davis, has organized a cultural and spiritual journey to Bahia, Brazil, for a group of Black women. And so I'm going to be accompanying them and, supported by Insight News and with our other representative in Brazil, Yoji. We're going to be broadcasting direct from Brazil, and I'm going to be writing my reflections. I've been to Bahia, but it's been almost a decade or more since I was there. So I'm interested to see what's happening. And Yoji is setting up some conversations for me with, with some of the Black women's organizations there. So I'm interested in what is happening with Black women in Brazil. I'm actually going to be reading what is one of their acclaimed biographies, a diary, I think, of a Black girl. I don't have the title exactly now, but I just got that in English, so I'm going to be reading that on the way, and then reflecting on this idea that what Francois Twine, a colleague of mine, calls racism in a racial democracy. So Brazil has this, it is presented as a racial democracy because you have all these different ways that you can talk about race. You can be negra, moreno, mulatto, preto. There are all these ways But still, Blackness, those people who are dark skinned, are always at the bottom. So I want to see how much has changed since the last time I was there. And then what are the efforts of Black women in particular to shift the dynamics of racism in this racial democracy?
And so, how important is it that we have conversations like this, that this work that you're doing go forward? I think it's amazing that the technology allows us to share more broadly, globally, in ways that we couldn't before. And given the impact and the access technology provides, how do you see change shaping up in the world, led by us, reflecting our will? What resistances are there to our forward movement? What do you think, Dr. Irma?
Well, I think one is particularly for Black folks. We have to understand that we are not the center of the universe. That is a very American-centered concept that somehow the world revolves around us. Brazil has the largest population of people of African descent outside of the continent of Africa.
Mhm.
It was where the majority of slaves were sent. And so we're only 12% of the population. Over 50% of Brazil's population has some ancestry that's rooted in enslaved Africans who were there. So we need to understand what they're doing, how they're managing the struggle, because it helps us understand, one, we're not alone. This is
Mhm.
not, racism is not a US thing, but it manifests itself differently. Latin America manifests itself. Racism is still there, but it looks different.
Mhm.
When you're in Europe, and we now have Blacks and other immigrant groups going who live in Paris and France and the Netherlands, and their experiences are somewhat different. And we need to be mindful of that so that when we encounter them, we have an understanding instead of trying to impose our particular history on them, but to understand how we have certainly inspired. The civil rights movement has inspired many Black movements, but that they also have their own history of Black movements that we may not be aware of because we're not taught global history. And now the little history that we did learn from having Black studies programs and Blacks and having textbooks, they're now trying to erase. So I
Mhm.
think having these kinds of broadcasts will give people information that may not be available in the normative textbooks.
That's a great place to pivot and talk about higher education, university education, textbooks, learning. I've got an article that's in Politico that is written by Charlie Matisian and Madi Alexander, I think published around July 21st. And the article is entitled, "This is Really a Big Deal, How College Towns Are Decimating the GOP." The subtitle is "Growing Population in America's Highly Educated Enclaves has led to huge gains for the Democratic Party. Republicans are scrambling for answers." I'll just read a couple of paragraphs here, and let's have you reflect on that. With the dateline of Madison, Wisconsin, the article says that spring elections in Wisconsin are typically low turnout affairs, but in April, with the nation watching the state's bitterly contested Supreme Court race, voters, this is in Wisconsin, turned out in record numbers. No place was more energized to vote than Dane County, the state's second most populous county after Milwaukee. It's long been a progressive stronghold thanks to the double influences of Madison, which is the state capital, and the University of Wisconsin. But this was something else. Turnout in Dane was higher than anywhere else in the state. The Democratic margin of victory that delivered control of the nonpartisan court to liberals was even more lopsided than usual and bigger than in any of the state's other 71 counties. One more paragraph here. The margin was so big it changed the state's electoral formula. Under the state's traditional political math, Milwaukee and Dane, Wisconsin's two Democratic strongholds, are counterbalanced by populous Republican suburbs around Milwaukee. The rest of the state typically delivers decisive margins in statewide races. The Supreme Court results blew up that model. Dane County alone is now so dominant that it overwhelms the Milwaukee suburbs, which have been trending left anyway. In effect, Dane has become a Republican killing Death Star. What does it mean, Irma, that uh, place matters in the national politics, place for universities and colleges? What's the story? What do you think?
Well, first, let me say I moved from inner city Chicago, where I grew up, to Grinnell, Iowa, where I went to college. Grinnell, Iowa is dead center in Iowa. It's 50 miles from any place. There's no airport or anything. But the town is it's the wealthiest college in the state of Iowa, and probably on competition with Yale and Harvard in terms of its endowment, which I understand has reached into the billions. The person who invented the Intel circuit chip, Robert Noyce, went to Grinnell, as did Herbie Hancock. So I know a bit about small towns. And what people forget is that college students are not isolation. They are part of the, they go to school to places for 4 years. If the place has a graduate program, sometimes they stay for longer. And many end up staying in that area. I think college students are now understanding, since COVID, the impact that political policies have on their lives and on their futures. And that as they stay around these college campuses, they're making a difference. And the GOP is right to be concerned, because there are many, many very small colleges. And I'll give you an example. I also went to graduate school at Amherst, Mass. The town itself is very small, but there are 3 colleges in that one small town: the University of Massachusetts, which probably employs most of the people; Amherst College, which is an elite college; as well as Hampshire College, which may be going under, but it was where the wealthy sent their kids to play. Like, you could get a bachelor's degree in Frisbee. And then just over the notch is Mount Holyoke, which is one of the Ivy League Seven Sisters schools. And then down the road in Northampton, 15 minutes away, is Smith College, another Ivy League Seven Sisters school. So just in that small area, you've got 5 colleges. And the students there tend to stay after they graduate for graduate school. Some end up investing, becoming part of the community. But while they're there, they're made very much aware that, what happens outside of the bubble has an impact on their future and their lives. And they're paying attention to that now. I think more so because of what happened in COVID. They saw things just disappear and be decimated, and that policy made a difference.
And so, what this means to the GOP is the question. The idea is you've got progressive and liberal thinking at these universities, and they are making a significant impact on the local election scene. And what's the projection of that in your mind as a strategy for evolving what I would call decency, and progressive liberal thought in
Right.
communities? How does the
I would
GOP
call
react
it
to
the
that?
Obama. Well, I would call it the Obama effect. They have
Mhm,
not had anything like what Obama was able to do, which was to mobilize youth. He
mhm,
had people out there canvassing. He had people who were in charge of many numbers of his political campaign. And the GOP has focused its energy on old money and older people.
mhm,
And COVID has eliminated a lot of people. A lot of older people were, whether they had money or not, COVID was an equal opportunity eliminator. It
mhm,
didn't care if you had money. Maybe you lived a little bit longer, but in the end, the human body reacts in the same way, and money
mhm.
does not safeguard you from that. It may prolong it. It may give you a little more relief, like we saw with Trump, who basically negated all of the kinds of things that people were being told to do to prevent COVID. And when he got sick, he and his family, they mobilized what he had 7 doctors, and he had the most advanced technology. So I think where the GOP has missed the boat is that they basically dismissed the youth. And now the youth are, stepping up to the game and making themselves heard. And these colleges where they attended, they see are at risk, as well as the rights that they have come to assume were always a given. They're seeing these being diminished.
This isn't on our topic today, but I think we can't avoid talking about the indictment of Donald Trump by the federal government for the effort to subvert the will of the people by changing the outcome of the election. Any feedback, any thoughts, impressions, of both the coverage and the actual indictment delivered earlier?
Well, Donald Trump is someone who likes to be on TV. And so whatever he does, he's going to be a spectacle. I would say the most dangerous person is actually DeSantis.
Mhm.
DeSantis is actually in a position as governor of Florida, and he is dismantling, he is firing people who do diversity, who are professionals. He is dismantling, he has also rewritten the history of what slavery was. You can no
Mhm.
longer talk about people being oppressed. You can no longer say that there were oppressors. And he wants to rewrite Black history so that it says that being enslaved meant that you actually had an opportunity to earn a skill that would serve you well if you got freed. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so I'm not so much concerned about Trump. I think he will always be a spectacle. It's the people behind him who are often not visible that we have to worry about, because he basically is an idiot. So there are other people, I've worked for the federal government. The president doesn't just run the show. There
Mhm.
are other people. When I worked for when I was at American Association for the Advancement of Science fellow, triple S fellow, we were given the talk, and there were people working in Congress, and they said the best thing you can do is to keep your boss from making a mistake. So our job was to sort of be on the lookout to see if this person was going to do something stupid. It is the people who are civil servants who have made a
Mhm.
career out of it who tend to keep the government afloat.
Mhm.
Political appointees come in, it takes some time to get acclimated, they're dependent. And so if we see when Donald Trump was in office, there was a lot of backtracking. He would say something, he would do something, and then his staff would have to backtrack and sort of correct it. I would say the dangerous person, if that person becomes real competition for Donald Trump, is Ron DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida. He's
Well, let me
dangerous
say,
because he's not an
uh,
idiot.
Mike V has a comment. Mike V says DeSantis has no pathway to victory when the GOP's goal was to bring more Black voters to the party. Alienating them
Hmm.
with the anti-woke campaign has hurt the party. You agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah, great, great.
Oh, absolutely. And also, he's going up against corporate giants like Disney, who are basically in favor of greater diversity. And so hopefully, if he does nothing else, he will just split the party in such a way so that nobody wins. I mean, that's my greatest hope, right?
Well, so let me take it one step further. I was talking to a neighbor of mine yesterday, and the logical extension of this division, and we hear it more from the right and from the center than we have ever, is a civil war in this country, a split. Are you hearing that at all? Are we, in your mind, from
Well,
what you hear in the
I
community?
I think there are people who there's always been anti-big government. And
Hmm.
this is the irony, is that the people who claim to not like big government are the people running for office to become government,
Hmm.
right? And it seems like they have an agenda to just disrupt and create chaos, which is really anarchy, in its truest form. People are saying that, but we've never stopped having a civil war. Maybe we don't have the armed until we had the takeover of the Capitol. There was no armed resistance, but racism and its institutional policies and structures have always presented barriers and opposition to the idea that Black people and Indigenous people should have full rights as citizens. That has always been at the heart of the conflict, and it is the mark, okay, the scar that is on democracy, is that on the one hand you have the ideals of a democratic society, and then
Hmm.
you have what is actually practiced, which is not democratic. So I don't know that we're moving towards a civil war, because I'm not sure that we ever extricated it ourselves from it. And the evidence of that was, in fact, all of the statues that were for the Confederacy, that
Hmm.
were on public campuses and in public cities. How could the people who lost the war have all these statues and monuments to them saying that they were the greatest when they lost? And so that says to me that there was always a sector, even if they didn't overtly agree with the Confederacy, in some ways gave them room and space to elevate their stature. So that civil war is still ongoing, and maybe it becomes more subversive. And now I think with the Capitol assault, that we see people being bodacious. I think what Trump gave them was this idea of being bodacious enough to say the most incredulous things,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And people are coming out like that. But there's a price to pay. And I hope that they continue to prosecute them and show that there are consequences to basically assaulting. This is an assault on democracy. And so people will have to choose that no matter what their political beliefs in, if they believe in the principles of democracy, they're going to have to come out against this kind of movement.
Any thoughts on the judge that's going to be trying the case in D.C. at this point, a Black woman who's an Obama appointee? I mean, it seems like poetic justice at the moment that Trump would have his day in court with the Black woman with the gavel.
I think what we will have to understand is that people are going to attack her.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to personalize this. They're going to challenge her. And we have to make sure that we provide her with the support. Nobody challenges the white judges who make these outrageous decisions. So, for example, in South Carolina, there's a pregnant woman who was charged with assault, and it was raised to the highest level for her words, for going to the police and confronting them when they were in their riot gear and saying, "I'm ready to die for my community. Are you ready to die for the blue?" 9 months later, and one of my former students is her attorney, Dr. Sybil Rosado. But it took them 9 months before they actually brought charges. And the judge gave this woman 5 years for the words that came out of her mouth. She did not hurt anybody. They tried to accuse her of inciting a riot, which she did not. She simply walked up to the police, put her chest against the shield, and spoke those words, and then walked away. All the other people who were there with her in the streets did not get these elevated charges. So the judges that are in place now, no one has challenged them, no one has threatened them, but this Black woman is going to be a target because that's what they do. That's how they fight, is that they go after the personal, they personalize it. So I think we just have to be vigilant and continue to write and raise people's awareness that this woman, in her capacity as a judge, has done nothing wrong and should not be targeted because she's simply the person who's going to rule over Donald Trump. And I say yes.
Let's pivot. There's a New York Times article I've got for us to talk about Irma, and the headline, it's an article that was published in July 24th. The headline says, "A study of elite college admissions data suggests being very rich is its own qualification." It's a piece by Atish Bhatia, Claire Kane Miller, and Josh Katz. And in summary, it says that elite colleges have long been filled with the children of the richest families, the Ivy League schools. 1 in 6 students had parents in the top 1%, and that a new large study showed that it's not because these children have had more impressive grades or on average took harder classes. They tended to have higher SAT scores and finally honed resumes and applied at a higher rate, but they were overrepresented, even accounting for those things. And it says for applicants with the same SAT or ACT score, children from families in the top 1% were 34% more likely to be admitted than the average applicant. And those from the top 1% were also more than twice as likely to get in. So talk about that, if you would. What does it mean about the entire system, and how does that factor into the challenges that are coming from our community about legacy, for example, and money, having and requiring, asking the entire institution to look at how it's been doing business, particularly since they wanted to not consider the question of the historic racial disadvantage that we've been victims of. What do you think?
Well, the article that I'm going to send to you begins that affirmative action, that admissions has always, college admissions at predominantly white institutions has always been about race. And it was an attempt to keep these colleges white. So, having said that, let me tell you that I speak from the point of view of an insider. I worked in admissions for 18 years. I worked at Mount Holyoke, which is an Ivy League all women's college. I then moved to the University of Massachusetts, which is a
Hmm.
public institution. And then I worked as an assistant dean. So I saw students with academic, discipline who were failing or having difficulty academically. So I've seen it from both the public and the private sector. And I also attended Yale Summer High School in 1968 before Yale became co-ed. I was one of the first women to be there in that summer program. And it was part of a program where they were trying to diversify. This is when white colleges were just opening up. I say that to say this: behind the scenes, it has always been clear that legacy trumps anything in terms of admission. That's how George Bush got in. George Bush
Hmm.
III got
Hmm.
into Yale. He was a legacy.
Hmm.
He was not the brightest bulb in the box, as we all know. He was the same as a president, but he got in. How is that possible? Legacy. My own institution, which is a very elite institution, I can tell you 5 generations of people where it's the parents, the grandparents, the great, now the grandchildren, the great grandchildren. It goes back that far. And so in all of these, I even got a letter from my children when they were born saying, you're sort of a legacy. And had they chosen to go, it's probably likely they would have gotten in. And so this has always been the case. This is affirmative action for white people and for the
Hmm.
wealthiest.
Hmm.
And even if you don't have wealth, if you have someone who previously got in and you're a legacy, that trumps. And so when Asian students made their case, had they included legacy, we would not see, I think, the assault on affirmative action. Because had they included legacy, then those people who were making the ruling, many of them themselves are probably legacy people.
Hmm.
Because when the program at Yale in the summer of 1968 was over, Yale University hired a consultant to evaluate the program. It was called the Singer Report. And what he wrote was this. He said, this is a very effective program. It's very successful. It was bringing inner city kids, people from the reservations, Puerto Ricans from New York, poor whites from Louisiana, all Black girl from Chicago, grew up in the projects. All of us were there and we were being taught the great books, including books on, by, uh, you know, uh, Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright, in addition, alongside Mark Twain. And we wanted to burn Huckleberry Finn, but they talked us out of it. We were putting on plays by Jean Genet. But this made us know that here we were from all these schools that were not the top schools. And we were reading Antigone, we were reading Hegel's Phenomenology, we were reading the Communist Manifesto, and no one told us that we shouldn't understand it.
Right.
So the report said this was and there's a documentary about it that the director made. They fired him. The Singer report says that this was a great program. However, it was not the mission of Yale University. Yale University's mission was to educate the 1,000 or whatever the number was of white young men to become leaders.
Hmm.
That is what the agenda is of these elite institutions, is to create those leaders.
Hmm.
And in that sense, those leaders are de facto white. And
Hmm.
so they will do everything, no matter how diverse they get. What Asian students didn't understand is that before Black folks came into these elite institutions, there were always Asian students. That number increased with affirmative action, and it diversified because the Asian population is not homogeneous. The people who historically have gone to these elite colleges are of Japanese and Chinese descent, who have a
Hmm.
long history. But if you start adding in newer populations of Asians who've come to this country, the Vietnamese, the Vietnam baby airlifts, people who are Hmong, Laotian, they
Thai.
tended to be fishermen. They came from more rural families. And so their success rate in terms of high school completion is actually on par with what we see with urban, African Americans. Affirmative action opened up space for that more diverse kind of Asian population to get in.
Mhm.
So by assaulting that and getting it sort of eliminated, they've basically stymied the opportunities, not only for potentially Black students at these elite institutions, but also for Asian students who are not of Chinese or Japanese descent, who don't come from privilege, right? So it was a mistake. Had they put those two things together, I don't think we would have seen the same ruling, because to attack the legacy meant that these people who are making the rulings would be limiting the opportunity for their own children down the road, and they're not going to do that. So it was a misdirection in some ways, and the real culprit, excuse me, the real culprit in all of this is really the legacy. Elites to some extent, athletes to some extent, right? And here is something I always said. How
Mhm.
is it that these elite institutions can find athletes from inner city schools who are, from these, but they can't find the science students? It's the
Can't find
same
scholars.
school.
Yeah.
So they can't find scholars. So how is it that you can go and find the top basketball or football player at these schools, but you don't stop and say, hey, by the way, do you have any good science students or any good students in math or literature? And so it's always been a phenomenon to me, because the emphasis was on that.
Mhm.
And as the report points out, and this is the kind of work that Ford was doing, Ford Foundation was funding back when I was there in 2005 to 2007, was looking at sort of how in third grade you would have like it was almost like a route to prison. In the
Mm.
third grade, they said schools could predict what Black kids were going to go to prison.
Mm.
And so they were exposing how these kids were being set up. They weren't learning, they weren't being literate, they couldn't read, they couldn't write. And so by the time they reached seventh or eighth grade, they're already at risk. And some of them are already in the system,
Mhm.
right? So these kinds of studies, they unpack and they reveal some of the issues. But the problem is that it's not going to change anything. I mean, that's the irony, is that
Mhm.
even knowing this, they will come up with some explanation, but they will still continue to admit the legacy, because in truth of fact, legacies, particularly those who are wealthy, are the ones who are funding them. They're adding to the endowment, they're having the buildings named after them. This is something that they've come to rely upon, the alumni. And when I was the first assistant director for minority admissions at Mount Holyoke College in 1974. I was the only one.
Mhm.
And alumni are a critical part of how they recruit students. So alumni direct the admissions people to what schools they should go to. Well, if the alumni come from elite schools, what is it that you're probably going to go to all elite schools?
Yeah.
You end up staying with those alum. Mount Holyoke was a little cheap, so I had to stay in the alumni's houses. Um, and so you see how they operate. They have certain schools they go to, certain counselors. So it's a kind of trend, if you will, that is going on. And I think people need to understand this is normative. This is what
Mhm.
all elite colleges do, whether they have $1 billion endowment or whether they just have a few $1 million. This is how they operate, because they rely on those alumni to then give back, you know. So
Let, let,
that's part of it.
well, let's pivot to the impact of this environment on HBCUs. There's an article by Stacy Brown, who's the editor at the National Newspaper Publishers Association. It's appeared in several of our newspapers around the country. But Stacy writes that in the wake of the Supreme Court's recent decision to end affirmative action in college admissions, Historically, Black colleges and universities have taken steps to adapt their admission policies. With the expected increase in applicants, HBCUs reportedly are gearing up to become more selective, aiming to maintain the quality of education they provide. Last month's ruling by the High Court, which prohibits colleges from considering race during the admissions process, has sent ripples through the academic landscape. For many universities, affirmative action has been crucial for fostering diversity and inclusion. And while not entirely unexpected, this decision poses a significant challenge to HBCUs, which have historically played a pivotal role in educating Black graduates and promoting racial diversity. So let me stop there, Irma. You again are in the middle of this situation as a college president, as an admissions officer, as an educator. Let's unpack that. What are the issues for HBCUs given the recent court decisions?
So first, let me say that I had the privilege of working as deputy provost at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, which our producer is an alumni of. I also I founded the Africana Women's Studies program at Bennett College for Women in Greensboro, North Carolina. I was president at Shaw University, and I've also been tenured at University of Florida. I got my degrees from University of Massachusetts, where I worked in admissions. And I also was tenured at the University of Minnesota, where I also helped found the Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center. One of the stats that people really need to hear that is in that article is that HBCUs are only 3% of all universities and colleges in the entire country. And I think there are about 3,500 of them at this point. Only 3%, but they actually graduate 25% of Black students. Wow. So that's number one. Yeah. The other stat that's not in there, but that I know because, we used to look at STEM, is that 85% of all women who go into the sciences graduated from either Spelman or Bennett. 85% of those who go on to get PhDs in the sciences in STEM got their undergraduate degrees from an HBCU, and for women, particularly from either Spelman or Bennett College for Women. That is an extraordinary, fact, okay, is that we would not have all of these Black women in the STEM area were it not for HBCUs. So one of the things people should also understand is that many HBCUs don't have Black Studies programs, okay? Clark Atlanta has a Black Women's Studies program, Spelman has one, but many of them don't have specific Black Studies curriculum because they were by definition the embodiment. They had the Black scholars. So for example, at Fisk, Anna Bontemps taught there. You had people, Aaron Douglas did the paintings on the wall in the library at Fisk, okay? He created the murals. So they were the embodiment of Black studies as opposed to the theoretical literature on Black studies. And I think that is what makes the difference.
Yeah, the environment itself was.
Exactly. You were drinking.
Yeah.
When I was at Fisk, there was a professor there who had been in the Harlem Renaissance. He was like 90 years old, and he'd sit in the library. I think he was still teaching one course, and people would just come and absorb. I mean, just listening to him, who he knew personally, was an entire course in the Harlem Renaissance because he knew them. He wasn't reading about them. He actually knew them and could talk about them. Yeah. I remember I lived in the apartments and walking past Anna Bontemps' house. I mean, just the fact that I was going to walk past the house that Anna Bontemps, one of the great literary figures of the Harlem Renaissance, had lived there. It's like phenomenal. There was an artist there who had trained with Aaron Douglas, to talk to him about what that was like. These are figures that people may not know. And in some ways, Jim Haskins has been who you did the whole issue to, has been telling us that story of that history. He has done the biographies of some of these people. So for HBCUs, what's going to happen is that people now want a place that is welcoming, because it's not clear that PWIs, predominantly white institutions, are going to be safe spaces for Black students. I remember when the Grutter ruling came down, University of Michigan, that they could not use race to some extent. What we saw was that institutions immediately eliminated scholarships that were specific for Black
Mhm.
students or
Mhm.
my historically underrepresented minority students and
Mhm.
Indigenous people. The Ford Foundation changed its name from the Ford Fellowship for Minorities to the Ford Diversity Fellowship. And while it still used one's identity as a factor, it was now open up to whites.
Sure.
And that changed the dynamics. It
Yeah.
had a separate listserv, and when white students get on there, they have a very different understanding of while they're there. Many of them, there were some who really were committed to diversity, but some of them just learned, just like they learned to write the right essay to get into these elite institutions, they get tutoring. And I know that there are companies that specifically pay people almost $200 an hour to help these students write these essays so that they can get into these institutions. Parents hire them. So they not only get coached with the SATs, but they also get coached in how to do an interview, how to
Mhm.
write the right kind of essay, because it's a process. Now, having been an assistant dean, I have seen students with board scores that were straight 800s across the board flunk out.
Hmm.
Okay. In other words, because you test well does not mean you know how to perform.
Right.
And so I had the advantage of seeing these elite students sometimes have academic difficulties. And I also was on the opposite end of getting the phone call from the state senator. Ted Kennedy's office was very good about calling up our office and say, well, we have this student that we have some concerns about, and we'd like you to take a look. And since we couldn't discuss the student specifically, my standard reply is that, well, I can't talk to you specifically about the student, but my suggestion is that you ask them to show you their transcript, because I'm looking at it and this student
Mhm.
has a 1.5 after like 3 years, and
Right.
mathematically it is impossible, even if they did a 4.0, which is a straight A average for 3 semesters, they can't come up to a 2.0. It's just mathematically impossible. So I would simply say, why don't you ask that student to share their transcript? And we never got a second call back. But that kind of intervention is normative. So
Uh-huh.
legacy, political, the influence that parents have, political interventions, these are the ways in which elites get into these institutions, not just based on, the fact that it's merit is a myth.
In the
It's
future,
merit
Irma,
and.
I want to have a conversation with you about alternative strategies. How do we both grow and maximize the potential for HBCUs to deliver quality education, learning for our people? But are there other systems now based on technology for learning that, as Greg Carr would say, means the community can jailbreak the ivory tower? That learning itself can be perceived as a process that's not limited to the traditional, but we can't talk about it right now. Irma, thank you so much. Hang loose. I want to bring my next guest in and spend the last part of the program talking about books. And W.D. Foster Graham is here. Brother Foster Graham, how you doing?
Al. It's great to be here one more time.
It's great to have you here. Great to see you always. You've got an author that you want to introduce us to, so I'm going to go straight to you. And if Irma's available still, you can jump in the conversation as well. Irma, I know you love books and literature, but let's introduce our guest today and have you start that interview.
Thank you, Al. Well, our guest author today is an award-winning author and essayist, a TV producer, a musician, and he is an unabashed chess nerd. He is an Amazon best-selling author, a native of Chicago, and he is the recipient of the Page One Award, also local Emmys. I had the honor of meeting him through Minnesota Black Authors Expo, and also the pleasure of hearing him share his work. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce two conversations from now McFarlane, Brother T. Aaron Cisco.
Brother Cisco, welcome to the program. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, let's talk about you. Tell people who you are and introduce yourself and your work, your vision, and your book.
Well, I'm just kind of like W.D. Foster Graham so graciously explained. I'm a big nerd, just putting it flat out. I read a lot, like science fiction, fantasy, just computers, chess, love chess. That was kind of my escape. I was a nerdy kid growing up. Now that I'm all grown up, I'm just a nerdy adult. I wanted to translate that and share that a bit. There's a fantastic quote from Toni Morrison that if there's a book you want to read that hasn't been written, then you have to write it. And as someone who reads a lot, both fictional literature, nonfiction, comic books, the whole thing, there's a huge lack in the certain types of characters and stories and narratives, especially within speculative fiction. So fantasy and sci-fi. I was always harder leaning towards the science fiction side just because we seem to be more representative. I found more characters that looked like me, that sounded like me, that looked and sounded like people in my family and my friends. Fantasy felt very singular, very one note. And I know that's not really the case, but what I was exposed to, was a lot of European, specifically Arthurian legends. So you got knights, you got dragons, princesses, horses, people with English accents in the adaptations in the films. And that's fine. Dragons are cool, swords are cool. But when it's fantasy, especially if you're drawing on cultures, I just felt that there's so much unexplored territory, especially when it comes to the Eastern Hemisphere. We're talking about West African mythology, West African folklore, and I really want to draw from that. And so with my book, The Unbanished, and then the follow-up, The Unrested, which was released earlier this year, I wanted to hit on that. I wanted to take all those tropes that I had seen and kind of push them to the side to let this other story come forward and get an audience. And
tell us about the story. Give us a little idea of what you said and how you said it. What was your approach shaping, introducing us to a different dimension?
Absolutely. Well, actually, the process was kind of fun. I wrote down the 10 things I found most annoying, the 10 aspects that I just couldn't see anymore. I couldn't take any more of it in fantasy.
List them. What were they? 1 through 10. What are they?
I don't want to put anybody on the spot or call out any authors, but for example, things like the male protagonist who's a chosen one, a heavy basis or borrowing from European, especially English or Arthurian legends. So no knights, no dragons, no princesses, no swords. There's some other fun things like the antagonist couldn't be evil. So in a lot of fantasy, you have an evil king, an evil sorcerer, evil wizard who wants to take over the kingdom or steal the princess or take all the gold, whatever it may be. So I don't want any of that. And so when I got rid of those tropes, what I was left with was a lot of fun. So the main character of The Unbanished is a Black woman named Orianne. She's a pacifist. She's academically minded. She's very scholarly. She is very skilled when it comes to physicality. If she has to fight, she can, but she prefers to think her way out of hard situations.
What's the time setting, present or future?
So it's sort of like a lot of good fantasy. It takes place in an alternate world. Okay. There are no firearms, no automobiles, but there's still technological advances, which I think mirrors a lot of the history that was overlooked in American education. We keep talking about yes, we had people in Europe that were developing irrigation and they built castles and they built boats and they came to the quote unquote new world. But while they were doing that, a few thousand years prior, we already had great societies. We had irrigation. We had currency and marketplaces and an economy that was thriving and education systems. We had mathematics, all these. And so the world that she inhabits is called, I use the term Javari. And it's basically kind of a mirror and allegory for a lot of the overlooked history that we actually have in the real world. They have a very complex social system, social structures. They have a very nuanced and sophisticated system of governance. They interact with each other just the same way that we do. They have education, they have professions. And Orianne, when the book begins, is at the end of her tutelage, which would be equivalent of someone going to university. She's being trained and she has to now choose her path in life as a profession. Now, because she's so skilled physically, her biggest concern is that her mental skills will be overlooked, that they will see her as like, you're strong, you can do this great. And I don't have to tell you all, that's definitely something that I think a lot of folks in our community can relate to. It doesn't matter. I'm 6'2" and in fairly decent shape. No one would expect that I lettered in chess. The question I got all the time was like, oh, so are you basketball or are you football? And I was like, well, I can do Rui Lopez. I know the dragon variation. Like, I'm a chess guy. What? And so playing on that preconception, that's Oriane. She's like, I want to be an instructor. She wants to go into education because she wants to help the rest of her community grow strong, the next generation. But there's a queen mother, Samaya, who has other ideas because she has her own ulterior motives, and she wants to recruit Oriane to help fund her somewhat nefarious plot, because she also sees issues and she has a different way that she wants to address them. When I mentioned those tropes beforehand with the idea of an evil antagonist, I didn't like that because I think oftentimes, specifically with the Black community, right, we are painted as either one of two things. We are either monolithic, where one speaks for all, we all have the same goals, ideas, opinions, it's just one voice, or we're kind of the crabs in a barrel. Like, we can't get ahead because we pull each other down. And I was like, of course, I mean, all of us know that's not the case, but it's not really presented much in media and mass comm. And so with my antagonist, with Samaya, she's not opposed to Oriane. She also wants to better Javari. The only thing is that her opinions and her plan to do so does come into opposition with Oriane's idea of what would be best for the nation. And so that serves as a central conflict. Now, it is a fantasy story, so there are monsters, there's adventure, there's some battle scenes, that kind of stuff. We got to keep it interesting, keep it fun. But again,
brother, it sounds like you had fun writing the book. I mean, your energy, in describing it is amazing. So the cover, tell us about the cover.
Oh, I mean, even that was a journey. I'll keep it brief, though. I found that while there are a lot of great artists, and there are a lot of affordable artists, sometimes those two groups don't overlap. And I had a very specific vision for what I wanted Oriane to look like. That's kind of a depiction of Oriane there on the cover. And I had a hard time finding artists that could actually bring her to life in painting or on the page. I got a lot of sketches back that really just looked like basically white women with brown skin. That's not what I was going for. And so I actually went online to a service called Fiverr. And I found a artist all the way over in Germany, and she, Brigitte Werner, and she produced this fantastic cover. That was when she showed me that, I was like, oh, that's Oriane. That's exact. It kind of hurt me a little bit that I had to go so far away.
Sure.
In my price range, I'll put that out there too. It wasn't that there are not great artists here, but
yeah. Well, one of our regular viewers, Michelle Madison, is asking, do you offer or even recommend any books for 2 to 9-year-old children? You have anything that you would recommend, or have you done things that you are doing for that age group?
I am. That's a fantastic question. I promise that I don't know who she is, but thank you for that question. My most recent work is called Before Asleep You Fall, because I had that same idea. I have 2 young girls, myself 2 daughters, and they're both in the ages where I found my joy of reading, and I wanted to contribute and create something that they could have also. Additionally, there are a lot of great authors here in the Twin Cities, although, can I say here in the Twin Cities? I know we're streaming live.
Yeah, that's fine, of course.
I'm in the Twin Cities. So in my neighborhoods, Crown Shepherd has 2 fantastic books. One is called, really easy to remember, Black Boy, and then there's another one called Black Girl. Both those books are absolutely phenomenal children's books. They would be age appropriate for the 9 and under crowd. They're also age appropriate and a lot of fun to read if you're over 9 years old. And there's a plethora. And I highly recommend, if I can plug a little bit, the Minnesota Black Authors Expo, which is actually coming up in just, I want to say like 2 months or so. It's usually in the mid-fall around October. And there are always multiple authors for every genre, but particularly children's authors present with their work on hand.
So are you full-time as a writer, Brother T. Aaron Cisco, or do you work as well and write?
I do work as well. I have a day job. I mean, writing is what I do, but my day job pays the bills, so to speak.
Okay. So what's it take to get to where your writing pays the bills? Is that one of your goals? Is that an aspiration, obviously, where you could devote yourself fully to writing, to being more creative? Or is it okay to have the distraction of a job, to keep you free to think when you are doing thinking time?
Well, I think when I wrote my first novel way back in 2016, which I know is not that far back, but feels a lot longer because the whole pandemic and everything has slowed the clocks down a little bit. That was my initial goal, was to just say, you know what, I want to be an author. I'm going to get these books optioned, and then I'm just going to write off. I'm going to be a Toni Morrison. I'm going to be a James Baldwin, heck, be a George R.R. Martin type. But in writing the books and seeing the reaction from readers and folks going to conventions and other events, that pull hasn't been as strong anymore. Of course, it would be nice, like if someone shows up and says, here's a very large check and now you don't have to worry about money, you can do what you want. I probably wouldn't go into the office anymore. I would just stay home and write. But as it is, I think it's great to have both, because being out there gives me more perspectives, and it gives me something to do, and I kind of bring things. I'll have conversations with folks that I will then translate into the books, or it's a nice kind of cathartic way to get that out there. And then sharing it also helps me meet more folks, because again, nerdy kid, nerdy adult, I'm not out mingling and mixing it up as much had I not had that. I think it's a lot easier to get out and about with the day job. Also, from a author perspective, I do think, or just artists in general, I do think it's important to diversify your endeavors. I'm going to keep dropping quotes, but B.B. King, one of my favorite musicians of all time, has a fantastic line that he used to say all the time about when he's hiring musicians for his touring band. He wanted somebody who was 50% musician, 50% good person. And then over time, they would turn to a 75% good person, 25% musician. And the way he found that out is that through their influences. He's like, someone who is only interested in sitting at home and running scales and practicing the different songs and pieces over and over and over again, well, they don't really understand. They can't put that emotion to it. If all they know is just like the notation on the page or the music being performed, but they don't understand the experiences or the life that's lived that influenced and inspired and created those notes on the page, well, that's not going to be as good or as interesting or as engaging of a artistic work. And I feel a little bit the same way about writing. I think that authors are fantastic. I'll speak for myself. Like, I love writing. I love expressing myself through prose. But I think if that's all that I did, I think there would definitely be a difference in the not the quality per se or the tone, but there would definitely be a sort of a paradigm shift in terms of.
Listen, we're out of time. Brother T. Aaron Cisco, Brother W.D. Foster, and again, thanks to Dr. Irma. She's still in the background there. Irma, thank you for being here. Let's have more of this conversation. I love to talk about the process of being creative and the mechanics of it, as well as the creativity. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. Thank you for being here. We will see you next time.